All right, YouTube, it's about time that I sort of talk about my predictions about what will happen within the Republican Party, within their primary process, going into Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and then on to Super Tuesday. The Democratic field, Bernie Sanders will probably end up winning New Hampshire. He might even win Iowa, but ultimately the DNC is controlled by Hillary allies. And while they're probably nervous because people don't like Hillary, this is merely evidence that she's a weak candidate. She's a Romney-style corporate centrist candidate who will not, I believe, win the general election, but still, I think it's pretty certain she's going to be the nominee, which is stupid for the Democrats to do, but yeah, they will make their bed and they'll have to lie in it. I think the Republican field being more crowded, being more perhaps charismatic or bombastic or offensive, as some people would term it, I think has made it much more of interest. There's your enthusiasm gap. Even people who lean to the left, they're talking more about the Republicans than they are the Democrats. They don't really care who the Democratic nominee is. They think it's a foregone conclusion. So I'm going to tell you what I believe will probably happen, assuming that things remain more or less stable. Any jump, a sudden surge for Ted Cruz, a sudden surge back up into the double digits for Jeb Bush, Trump surging or collapsing could throw my prediction off. But if things remain more or less stable, as they have for some time now, and Trump stays around where he is and Ted Cruz evens out or slowly rises until the beginning of the primary process, here's what I think will happen. I think and I should say there are several different outcomes that could possibly happen in the first three states and through Super Tuesday as well that could change what the inevitable conclusion will be. But by the end of Super Tuesday, we'll probably have a pretty good guess who the nominee is going to be. Going into Iowa, I expect Ted Cruz to eke out a win there. It's not going to be a strong win. He'll lead by less than 5 points over Donald Trump. That's what I think is most likely to happen. He's consistently leading in the latest polls by a very small margin. It's within the margin of error, but it's an aggregate of the polls. So there's no reason to suggest that he will lose the state. But here are the two possibilities. He could outperform and Trump underperform, in which case it throws Trump's entire candidacy into question. Because he is built largely on I can win, I can do this, I will be the next president style charismatic momentum. If he underperforms, it brings into question whether he even wins New Hampshire. You could see somebody like Chris Christie pull off a surprise and upsetting win there. Again, not necessarily the most likely outcome, but it is possible that that could happen. That would probably destroy Trump's entire campaign, and Ted Cruz would probably be battling it out with whoever the establishment candidate happens to be. And Ted Cruz is half establishment, half outsider. He's really Tea Party light when you think about it. He's got that evangelical voice and the baby face and the sort of center left views almost on things like immigration, although he pretends otherwise. He's not really an outsider, but he's not liked by the establishment either to some degree. The Rovites don't like him. Some of the other insiders do. So Trump could underperform, in which case he might be screwed. The other possibility, and I don't think he'll underperform. I think there's a possibility, though, that he will overperform, that he'll actually do better than he's expected. He could even win Iowa. If at the end of the night, when the votes are being tallied, it turns out that people were underestimating Donald Trump's support by 5 points and he manages to win the state by less than a point or something, then he probably at that point he's the nominee already because he's already slated to win New Hampshire and South Carolina if he wins all three of the first states. Going into Super Tuesday, the kind of bump that he'll get from that, because people will abandon other candidates, say, well, it's obvious what's going to happen now, and the field will still be jam-packed with insiders splitting that vote. He'll probably go on to win all the Super Tuesday states, or at least the vast majority of them. I think there are 12 different states up for grabs on that night, or 8 states. It's a fairly large number if he manages to win all of them. I think he's got like a third of all the delegates sewn up at that point. You've got to realize, though, here's one thing that Nate Silver and others appear not to have figured in. In 2012, at this period in time, Mitt Romney was hovering around the upper 20s to 30 points. Trump's ahead of that. The race wasn't as crowded in 2012. You had two other perfectly viable candidates, Santorum and Gingrich. Ron Paul had joined in and very stubbornly clung to about 10 to 15 points of support throughout the entire. He never dropped out. Throughout the entirety of the race, even after Perry and Kaine were gone. You had these three other candidates, all of which were consistently in the double digits. It was a crowded field. And it wasn't until the middle of April of that year that Mitt Romney had won enough states so that the support for Gingrich began to collapse after Gingrich had swept parts of the South up. And Rick Santorum, he kept going up and down at various points, but he never, after that point in mid-April, he didn't win any other states. It became, the conclusion was that Romney was going to be the nominee. And that's why they lost, of course, as well. But Santorum, going in, he won Iowa, and he went on to win about a dozen of the flyover states. He had the evangelical support necessary. What do we know about this race? Ted Cruz is the Rick Santorum of this election cycle, but he's sharing his support with Ben Carson and some of these others, because evangelicals, while they're more homogenous than other groups, are not completely homogenized. Some of them are supporting Carson. Some of them are supporting Trump, and some of them are supporting somebody like Rand Paul. And so Ted Cruz, I would not assume, unless he wins Iowa. If he loses Iowa, I wouldn't expect him to win any of these flyover states, because his support will not continue to grow. Trump will end up, eating away at his support, even if Carson dropped out. Right now, if Carson were to drop out, I would expect most of that support to go to Ted Cruz, because they have the most in common. If, however, Ted Cruz fails to win Iowa and people perceive him as weak and unable to win, I would expect it probably to go to Donald Trump. That would put him above 40, probably secure him the nomination. But you got to realize it wasn't until the late April that Mitt Romney broke through 50%, even though that race was far less crowded. Donald Trump is only 15 points away from that. Earlier than Romney was at that point in a much more crowded field with numerous candidates that haven't yet dropped out. On to New Hampshire. Trump, if he wins in Iowa, I would expect, obviously, he's going to win New Hampshire, and he's going to win South Carolina regardless. He could suffer a double-digit collapse right now, and he would probably still win South Carolina. He would be the Newt Gingrich of this cycle if he were to lose somehow in Iowa and New Hampshire. Romney only won one of the first three states, and he only won half of the Super Tuesday states, and yet became the nominee. Right now, Trump is ahead, I believe, in all but one of the Super Tuesday states and in two of the first three states, and he's barely losing in Iowa. He's in a stronger position in a more crowded field than Romney was in a field where really there were only two other viable candidates there, and then there was the factional Ron Paul, who I liked, honestly, who kept eating away at the support of these other candidates. Now, people who might have supported Santorum and given him the nomination weren't supporting him. They were supporting Ron Paul instead, sort of the younger, the Tea Party set and so forth. They all went for him. And so you had four basic candidates in 2012. You had the insider, Romney. You had the evangelical, Santorum. You had sort of the Southern Democrat turned Republican nativist candidate who people remembered as sort of the anti-Clinton figure, which was Gingrich. And then you had someone who didn't win any states, but consistently came in second or third in some of them, which was Ron Paul. Now you've got the outsider nativist who has managed to combine what used to be like Gingrich support in the Deep South with urban support, with traditionally establishment cores of support, which is Trump. You have the kind of evangelical who nonetheless has not coalesced the entire evangelical movement, which is Cruz. You have sort of the true insider in Rubio, and then you have the the more hard-line version of Ted Cruz, which is Carson, and then you have Jeb, which is sort of Rubio with less support. And then you have a bunch of other factional candidates. This will lead to a different conclusion, I believe, and it won't be until the end of Super Tuesday that we can tell what's going to happen. Trump will win South Carolina. He will probably win New Hampshire. The fact that he's likely to lose in Iowa is probably not going to matter much because Ted Cruz, most of his support is coming from rural states where Trump is not leading as handily. His cores of support are in the urban states, the Northeast and the West Coast, and in the Deep South and parts of the upper Midwest, sort of the Union states, where he's gaining support from the fact that many of these union groups haven't yet bothered to endorse the Democratic Party, or Hillary in specific. They might endorse Trump, which would cause more problems, I think, for Hillary when she's nominated. There's now evidence to suggest that something like 20% of independents and Democrats would defect to Trump if he was the nominee. Probably, because you've got to understand, a section of the Democratic Party is not too concerned with Trump's views on immigration. They're really more fiscal Democrats. And they almost see more in common with Trump than they do somebody like Hillary, because Hillary is a corporate candidate. She's known to be backed by big banks and corporations. Trump is self-funding. There are people within the Democratic Party, actual liberals, who would rather vote for a Republican. I mean, it's thrown everything into chaos. It's actually funny, which is why I say if Trump is the nominee, he'll probably be the next president. Again, whether you like him or not. I think some of his views are bunk, some of them are okay. But yeah, he'd be elected probably if he was running against Hillary Clinton. Sanders, maybe not. Sanders might be able to defeat him because he's more of an outsider, more of a progressive Democratic socialist. Going into Super Tuesday, though, the performance of the candidates going into these states, and I don't expect anyone other than Trump, Cruz, or maybe Rubio to win any of these states. It's going to come down to a three-man race at that point. Going into Super Tuesday, Trump needs to have won 2 of the first 3 states and at least finished second, a strong second in Iowa. If he can do that, he's likely to take all the Super Tuesday states. If he manages to do that, then it doesn't matter when people begin dropping out because much of that support will end up in his camp. It's not these people. Ben Carson's supporters are going to abandon Cruz, which they might have supported, and they'll support Trump. Rand Paul's backers, they're not going to support somebody like Christie or Rubio who might hang on as the insider because of the police state and surveillance stuff. They're not going to support them. The pro-gun groups will flock to Trump. Some of the evangelicals might half-heartedly support him. It really comes down to this. Do we envision... There are two possible things here. Technically 3. He could perform exactly on par with the polls, in which case he's still got a better than 50-50 chance of getting nominated because he's ahead in most of the states. He could underperform based on the fact that people go in. They go in to vote, and they go in there saying, well, I'll probably vote for Trump. And at the last second, they say, yeah, but he said this, he said that, I'm not sure I really want to support him. I'll just vote for Ted Cruz or, some other candidate. And it'll be a split vote, people who do that. In which case he might not win the 2 of the first 3 states that he needs, or he could underperform in Iowa, lose support in New Hampshire, and barely eke out a win there, weakening his campaign. He could collapse before Super Tuesday or something. The other possibility, this has been spoken of, and there is some evidence to suggest this may be the case, is that Trump is actually 5 to 10 points higher and further ahead than polls suggest, based on the concept that people simply don't want to openly admit that they support him. If this is the case, he will win Iowa and could win it handily. I don't expect him to get that much of a bump. I believe this effect itself is probably real. I choose to believe it's probably not 10 points, it's probably 1 or 2 points, in which case he will be almost tied in Iowa. He will decimate his opponents in New Hampshire and South Carolina, solidifying his support in the Deep South, solidifying it in the urban states. He'll be like Romney if Romney had won the Gingrich states, which means that he will have a very large majority of the delegates going into the actual convention. Ted Cruz, meanwhile, he'll win Iowa by a small margin. He'll go on to win some of the rural states, some of the evangelical strongholds, maybe even a couple of the states in the Deep South if he performs well enough on Super Tuesday. Gets at least a few second place wins or wins a state or two. Otherwise, yeah, I think it's probably going to be Trump getting nominated. And I think these folks, such as Nate Silver, with their calculations, they've made a mistake here, I believe. They're focusing on the mathematics of the present race without an eye to the history of former races. And Nate Silver is extremely good at predicting what will happen on election night. He was very good in 2012 at that. He was very good in 2008. He did well in both of the midterms in that same period. But he doesn't appear to be fully accounting for the fact that the race that's currently going on is so much more crowded. There are so many different smaller factional candidates eating away at what would be establishment or in some cases outsider support. The fact that the last few elections have been primarily about the economy. 2010, it was all about government too powerful, taxes too high, constant problems with debt. In 2012, it was the same. In 2014, it was the same, and in 2014 as well. Republican leadership has abandoned us. It has swung heavily now, though. You're hearing very little about the economy. What are you hearing about right now? Immigrants and the border, terrorism, and should we or should we not get involved in such and such foreign theater. Added to this, a few social things like gun control. Trump has lambasted Obama on this, so has Cruz. Other than that, it's primarily about foreign interventionism and border security, things that appear to be giving the advantage to the Republicans. You also have to understand these other races, since Nate Silver began to operate at that time, involve Obama's Democratic Party. Obama's not in this election. Hillary Clinton will be in this election. This carries with it the Clinton brand name, the Clinton scandals, the Bubba Bill controversy with Paula Jones and all these others. This is a fundamentally different race. It's not the Bushes versus the insider Democrats of the Obama group. The Obama inner circle and the Clinton inner circle are largely mutually exclusive. The Republican Party is not currently being led by a centrist within the establishment like Romney, like John McCain, like the Bush family. Jeb Bush is in 6th place right now, will probably drop out, possibly before Super Tuesday. Actually, for somebody like Trump, it would be beneficial if he waits until after Super Tuesday to leave the field. Because Jeb Bush, he's going to come in like maybe 3rd in one of the first 3 states, if he's lucky. He's likely not even to perform that well. Marco Rubio is sort of the Jeb Bush now, with actually enough support to pull off maybe a 2nd place win. You see also a lot of Trump has support across the board in many of these states. Cruz is focusing heavily on just Iowa. Rubio is focusing heavily on just Florida. Christie is focusing heavily on just New Hampshire. These candidates don't have the money or the support necessary to focus on multiple states. They're focusing on one little region or one specific important early state. It's not ultimately, I believe, going to make much of a difference. We are now too close to the beginning of the actual voting for most of these candidates to make a measurable impact in these states. Christie will probably not pull off a win in New Hampshire. Trump could, in theory, supplant Ted Cruz because they're only separated by a couple of points in Iowa. I'm still counting on Ted Cruz winning Iowa just as Santorum won in 2012. He didn't go on to become the nominee. In fact, the person who wins Iowa often does not become the nominee. Iowa is a rural bellwether for how the for how the farming core of the country with very few delegates is going to perform. You got to look to New Hampshire in order to understand what's New Hampshire went for Romney. I believe New Hampshire went for McCain as well. That's closer to being sort of the mean median and mode of how the Republican Party is actually going to vote. Iowa, more rural, more evangelical and religious. South Carolina, deep South, very much inclined towards sort of the deep South mentality. South Carolina is the bellwether for how the rest of the South is going to vote, in which case we would expect much of it to go for Donald Trump. Iowa speaks for the sort of core of the country, the heartland, the rural states there. New Hampshire speaks for many of these other states. We're talking the urban coasts of the country. We're talking about parts of the upper Midwest, possibly down into like Ohio and Indiana and Missouri and some of these other states. I would expect if the voting were held today in all 50 states, that Trump would end up winning about 40 to 45 of them. It would be an overwhelming majority of delegates that he would be drawing. And it wouldn't be possible for them to use a brokered convention to try to get rid of him, because then other candidates from the outside would just, their delegates would end up pledging support to him instead of backing Jeb or Rubio or one of these, or Cruz or one of these insiders. And the Republican Party would nominate Cruz at its hazard anyway. I don't believe Cruz could win the general election. He's put forth too many evangelical views. The Republican Party now, with two basic viable candidates, which are Trump and Cruz, has to make a decision. Do they stand in Trump's way and nominate somebody tied to Santorum-style evangelical sentiment, which has always held the GOP back? It has never worked. It has never been good for the GOP's vote. It has always caused them to lose elections unless you're talking about something happening in a deep red part of the country. It's not going to help them win any of the fucking swing states. You think that the Pennsylvanians or people from Wisconsin are going to vote for somebody like Ted Cruz? I beg to differ. And that includes if he's running against somebody as weak as Hillary Clinton. Or do they allow Trump to be nominated, who has more support than Cruz does? That's evident at this point. He's about 15 points ahead, for Christ's sake. Do they nominate him and deal with the fact that his nativistic views might energize segments of the Democratic Party, with some evidence to suggest that some Democrats would rather vote for him than vote for a corporate candidate like Hillary? That's the choice that the GOP has to make. I believe it's safer and going to help them win the election if they nominate Donald Trump. They should not stand in his way. And I would point out, every time somebody has tried to stand in his way, he turns it into a talking point and gains more support. So far, nothing he has said, regardless of how divisive it is perceived as being by the GOP, by the Democrats, or by anyone else, so far none of it has sunk his campaign. In fact, most of the time, it gives him a bump in the polls. He's cobbled together more than a third of the GOP, presumably some independents, and now they're saying possibly even some Democrats in support of him. Now, the Hillarys and the social justice warriors have tried to say, oh, well, fake Democrats, Democrats should vote for Trump, because we already know that Hillary will be the nominee, but Trump is weak and she'll destroy him easily, so we should go out and we should register as Republicans in states where we can and vote for Trump. Probably not the greatest idea. They'd be better served voting for Cruz at this point. Try to get him nominated. Evangelism is a lot less popular than nativism. The far out there sort of multi-culti left within the country that's a minority of the Democratic Party is under the delusion that multiculturalism is extremely popular and that most Americans don't really want border defenses. They want blanket amnesty. Their idea of immigration reform is anyone who wants to come here should be able to come here, no questions asked. That's not the case. You may believe in that more, oddly enough, libertarian border system. Most Americans don't. Most Americans do want a border wall. I choose to believe that's a bad idea, but most Americans do want that. Most Americans do want to throttle the number of visas for people entering the country legally. Most Americans do want to deport those that are here illegally. This is a liability for the Democratic Party. I may side with the Democrats more or less on this. The Republicans are right in that we need, border defenses. We need to properly staff the border. I don't believe in mass deportation. I see it as a constitutional affront because it would require them to go door to door without warrants in order to search for illegals. I'm not sure if the Tea Party quite understands this, especially the Tea Party being as active as it is in Texas and Arizona and places like that. But it's a liability for the left. Quite clear. It's like gun control. Most Americans do not support expanded gun control. If you ask them specifically about gun show loophole checks on sales, about background checks at gun shows, they'll generally support it. You ask them about most specific issues involving gun control, and they don't want them. They oppose them. Support for gun control in this country peaked in the 1980s into the early 90s. It's far below that now. And with gun deaths falling, it's only a matter of time before the partisans realize that their facts and figures about this gun crime epidemic are not actually reality. They will eventually realize this. That'll just fuck up gun control efforts in the future even further. But right now, the Democratic Party is at a disadvantage because public discourse is primarily about things that give the advantage to the Republicans. The Republicans have very wisely, not made an issue out of abortion and gay marriage to any great extent. There was the Planned Parenthood bullshit. They shut up about it. Good. Keep shutting up about it. You make it an issue, you lose the election. That's another piece of advice. They're dead issues. America is not with you on this. It's just like the left in gun control or the left in we need blanket amnesty. Dead issue. You're not going to get your way on it. You may support it. Your partisans may support it. You're going to fuck up yourself in the general election with the independent voters if you don't leave the issue alone. You can foment it all you want once you're in office. If you're running for re-election, it might be a problem. You can foment it once you're in office. But if you do it on the campaign trail, you're screwed. And Hillary, unfortunately, has already raised the gun control issue. Obama has injected it directly into the race, probably because he knows it'll screw Hillary Clinton. Not going to go well for her. So, yes, I predict that Trump will win 2 of the first 3 states. He'll go on to win most of the Super Tuesday states. If I'm wrong, it'll be because his support has been either underestimated, in which case he might win Iowa or tie in Iowa, or overestimated, in which case he would underperform in New Hampshire to the degree that people would say, well, maybe he's not as invincible as we thought. Super Tuesday could go awry for him, and you could see a bunch of other candidates edging in on what would otherwise be his territory. We have to wait until the first 3 states are through. Or rather, the first 2. We know he's going to win South Carolina by a double-digit total, so we don't really have to worry about that as far as figuring who the nominee will be. We need to see how Iowa and New Hampshire go. I predict he wins New Hampshire by about 10 points. He loses Iowa by a point or 2. This puts him clearly in the lead. It puts him ahead of Cruz. It puts him ahead of Carson. It puts him ahead of Jeb and Rubio and all these others. He then goes on to sweep Super Tuesday fairly effectively because nobody else has coalesced a movement as large as any of the potentially viable second-tier candidates did in 2012. Gingrich was evening out at around 20 points. So was Santorum. Ron Paul had 10 to 15%. More than half the field had not coalesced under the front runner. That may not be the case this time around. If Trump continues to rise for the next couple of weeks and averages around 40, he'd be right on par and even slightly ahead of where Romney was going into the first 3 races. And remember, Romney only won 1 of those states. He only won New Hampshire. He got completely ass-blasted by Gingrich in South Carolina, and he lost narrowly to Santorum in Iowa. Another couple of points for Trump in Iowa. And it will be almost exactly the same result as Santorum versus Romney in 2012. It would not look good for Ted Cruz to basically be the doppelganger of Rick Santorum. And Rick Santorum, the real person right now, is at what? Half a point. So he's obviously not going to be a major player here. That's about all. Peace out.